Hello, everyone. My name is John Desjarlais, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indigenous Resource Network, and you're listening to the Indigenous Voices and Resource Development podcast. On this episode, you'll hear from Jeff Gaulin, who is the Global Vice President of Corporate Affairs for Vale Base Metals, a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario, and probably part of the network. So, hi, Jeff. How's it going today?
It's great, John. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. I'm super excited to have you. Got to know you and meet you in person. We did a little chamber tour last fall. We presented in Winnipeg and had a lot of fun. But, one of the ways we love to start off our podcast is we like to kind of lean into that kinship aspect, that relational aspect. So tell us a little bit about you, a little bit about where you're from, and then, lead into, how you ended up where you ended up today.
Well, thanks a lot, John. And thanks for having me on the show. I loved our chat and I've loved being a champion and an ally for Indigenous opportunity across Canada. I've worked in the natural resource sector for about 25 years. Across the country. I'm in Toronto now, but I cover coast to coast. But I've been in oil and gas and electricity production. I've been in land use and environmental services. And every single one of those, there has been opportunity and challenges about Indigenous development, workforce, and community relations. And so I feel quite blessed that I've had such a diverse career. And my own background and my own family ancestry and history has made me an ally and somebody I think that within a corporation can help bring about change within as well as without. So just a great opportunity to be here today.
Well, that resonates strongly with me. I think there's an element of service that we just see that is quite consistent across, Indigenous people, and especially in the resource industry. I think in every industry there's an interest. Of course, you serve, your organization's interest, but there's also reciprocity. How do we serve back, right? And how do we serve the and around us? And the rising tide raises all canoes, right? And so, yeah, it's always wonderful to hear that. We never prompt that. That comes up every single time. So that's super cool. So you've had an incredibly fascinating, I think looking at your experience and getting to know a little about you, you've had a fascinating journey from journalism, and energy. You talked about working in oil and gas, and now, of course, mining and critical minerals, and you're part of that discussion. So, what drew you to resource development? And then, of course, what drew you to where you are today? How did this journey, kind of unfold? Did you imagine you were going to be where you are today, when you were thinking about when you started in your career, 20 some years ago?
No, actually, it's interesting what you talk about, that sense of service. I got into journalism because I was interested in what was going on around me and my community. And, not just reporting things that went bump in the night, but what things that changed people's lives. And I was a small town newspaper reporter, and you could see the impact that telling stories, bringing people together, and tackling what one of my great leadership coaches once said, discussing the undiscussables, right? Surfacing things that maybe were uncomfortable. And I love that in journalism, but I never thought I would jump from that to working in the British Columbia government, to going to be a beer lobbyist of all things after that. But what drew me into the natural resources space was, I think, the tremendous complexity, opportunity, and challenge. And that's what's so great about it. If it was easy, we wouldn't be talking about it. We wouldn't be grappling with issues of shared land use and prosperity, historical reconciliation, and future opportunity. And I think that's the rich opportunity as I see for everyone within Canada in the years ahead. We are blessed by geology and geography to have many things that we don't need, but the world does. And so the way in which we can benefit from the world around us, be stewards of the world around us, and be nurturers for the communities and the people around us, I think is a unique opportunity in natural resource development that I can't say that I found in other sectors. I did work in consumer packaged goods. It was a little bit of a variance in my career, if you say, but I always came back to natural resources because I think it brought all that together. And I guess I hadn't thought of it, but I do feel very driven by a deep sense of service. And I find that that's naturally intrinsic within the resource sector.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, someone once asked me that not too long ago. It says, "Oh, did you ever imagine, you'd be doing what you're doing today when you were, 18-year-old self?" I was like, you know what, 20-year-old self would have been blown away, or 18, yeah, by what 18-year-old self would have been blown away by what 20-year-old self was doing. Mind what, I'm doing today. But, and I hear this through what you talk about, why we do it doesn't really change, and so we don't know what we're going to be doing, but I think there's a kind of a values kind of approach to, the choices we make and the things that we get involved with and why we do it. And like you, I'm very much drawn to natural resources as well too. And, in that space and then, just being, being useful, right? So,
Well, I love it too because as much as I spend time in airports and offices, I love being outdoors. And there's nothing like, walking around a mine site or a reclaimed mine site or reclaimed oil sands land, or cut timber forest or, agricultural land and not have this immense sense of responsibility to feel connected. We take from the earth because we need, but we also have a tremendous responsibility to restore. I mean, neither of my parents went to high school. I was the first in my family to graduate high school, go off to university. I've never done this because I was, worried about my career or climbing a corporate ladder.
hmm
It was about doing things that mattered,
hmm
and seeing that it could really have a positive impact or
hmm
restoring a positive impact to people and to community.
No, that resonates strongly with me, and it should resonate with everyone else. It's a real kind of a purpose-driven approach to making the choices that we do, right? And like you, I absolutely, yeah, I spend a lot of time in commercial or in urban centers and airports and hotels and stuff like that, but always drawn back to to kind of remoteness, to land, but also, a bit of a nerd. I love, being on different industrial sites, right? And so there's the STEM nerd in me, but there's also, where did this come from? How does it go? And then yes, how do we return it, right? And so once we get that use, and how do we return it in, all good ways possible, right? And so that we can continue to use and enjoy, the region, the land in perpetuity. So, we've heard quite a bit about, critical minerals, right? Especially people that are engaged in the discourse that we're engaged in, critical mineral strategy, electrification, mining, building mines, the importance of it. And so, what is something that people might be surprised to learn about working in mining in the critical mineral space?
Well, it's interesting. I think mining has a bad rap within mining. And what often blows people away is just how high tech or advanced the services and the way in which we mine, right? I think a lot of people still have sort of almost a cartoonish or 19th century kind of mindset about mining. But when we are looking to deploy artificial intelligence to help map underground, where's the best place to drill for some of the reserves or bring to surface in the least impactful, most
Mm,
economic way possible? That we couldn't have done 5 years ago, maybe even 5 months ago, but is now kind of the future. I think people are shocked at how sort of high tech or modern or innovative mining can be. And the second thing is, and I truly have found this within industry, is the deep and genuine commitment to responsible development, whether that's reforestation, habitat restoration, biodiversity protection. Of course, decarbonization has gathered a lot of attention, but when you look at the totality of impact on the environment, there's a deep and broad, and I would say genuine commitment within most mining companies, certainly mine, but others that I've engaged with. And
mhm,
so, critical minerals, I don't know who came up with that term, but boy, they should get a gold star for branding because it's really been helpful to kind of
mhm,
elevate the discussion from perhaps an old or outdated way of seeing how mining is done to having a future looking way of what is mining for. And I think that's a change that we've actually seen around the world. People are now focused on what are those minerals for more than, and who has them and can I get some, than how were they done 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Absolutely. There is a shift, and I think, there's certainly an opportunity that we need to embrace to help, I think, raise the awareness in regards to that shift, right? And you're right, there's an incredible modernization in terms of mining, and it's growing in leaps and bounds. One of the things I know, I'm challenged with and we're challenged with is we see exodus might be a strong term, but I'll sensationalize it a bit. There's an exodus in terms of young people interested in the careers that they're choosing, where a lot of the commodity, a lot of the resource base are seen as kind of a dirty, process, right? And then a harmful harmful process. And you're right. I think the script needs to be flipped and said, well, it's a necessary process. There is demand, there's need, there's modernization, there's technological improvement, and you need these resources to drive, this action. And so the opportunity is not to walk away from these industries, but to lean into that and say, how can we change how how can we continue to help these industries evolve, right? These practices evolve, introduce, artificial intelligence, modernization, innovation. We hear lots in the energy space. There's this great opportunity to help with decarbonization in terms of emission intensity profile and all those things. And so you way greater opportunity to influence its environmental impact and output, because that is balanced with the demand for resources, right? And so we need the people, we need the innovation, because the world is expecting and demanding. Our energy needs are continue to grow exponentially. And so how do we think we're going to serve those, right, in a meaningful way, in a meaningful transitional kind of way, right? And so it's incredible. I want to change gears here a little bit. We are the Indigenous Resource Network, and I wanted to ask, what from your perspective, what does it mean to you to bring an Indigenous perspective to energy and to mining and those industries? What does that mean to you?
It means quite a lot. I mean, from my own background, having been adopted out from my biological family, I didn't connect to my ancestry until later, although I was always kind of raised knowing that. And I would say, more of a quiet champion for that
Mm,
reason, because my lived experience isn't the same as friends or even family, biological
mm,
family with whom I've reconnected. But what's important is to be able to genuinely bring it forward in an organization, and as I like to say, make visible what has been invisible within the organization or within the value chain of a company or an industry. And I remember talking once with JP Gladu when he was back at the Canadian Aboriginal Business Council, and we had him come in and speak on Truth and Reconciliation Day to some of our executives. And I remember what was really touching of all the things that we had discussed that day was where he said, make visible the Indigenous leaders within your company. Find ways that aren't tick the boxes exercise, like, well, we've got so
mm,
much percentage of the workforce or so much of our procurement spend or this, but just make people and make them present in your organization. Give people role models to aspire to. And even if you're not Indigenous yourself, you can be a champion for others and make space for others. And that really struck me, and it really struck the organization. And I've carried that forward with me through a number of organizations subsequently, that I think it is important that Indigenous voices are given space within organizations. They have seen and have fully merited their contributions there, and that there's a genuine spirit of reconciliation within an organization, not to dwell on the past, but to create a new future. And I think that sometimes has been perhaps overlooked in I'd say, the diligence that some corporations have now made incorporating Indigenous history learning or cultural training. So much has been on the past. That is an important part, but we also live in the present and for the future. So carry that forward, bring that forward. So whether you can do that as an individual, whether you can do that as a force for change, it's part again of that theme of service. And you don't have to be Indigenous to do it, but you do have to be genuine. And
mm.
I think that is something that I've seen really emerge within an organization, and it's meant a lot for me that I can help bring people along in that way, not push people into that,
Mhm.
but inspire them into it.
It's that is inspiring, and of course, it's not surprising that my dear good friend JP would mention something like that, right? And so, who's always making space for other Indigenous people as well too. But it's incredible, and you're exactly right. It's fascinating. I remember being two different things being told. You want to be. I remember being told you want to be. You want to be a good engineer that happens to be Indigenous. You want to be a good business that happens to be Indigenous. It's like, no, that means that being Indigenous doesn't add value to being a business person, or being Indigenous doesn't add value to being an engineer. And I don't know if that's necessarily, the how it was being explained or what was being said, but that's what it felt like as an Indigenous person, right? And so, but making space for people, and this is where it comes back to that point. Indigenous people are capable, accomplished. They have the merit. They have some merit, I think, that competes on all terms, right? And so, and value and intrinsic value and dignity and all those things. And it's so important to create space. And yes, role models, identification relation matters, right? If so, we have someone performing, look at this Indigenous person and an identification, people follow, right? And so I know I struggled as a person because who could I identify and relate? Who's a small town Indigenous boy that was doing things that I could have never imagined possible, and some things I just had to. Fortunately, I just got stubborn enough. I pushed my way into them. But sometimes, thankfully there was a few people to kind of aspire that are doing incredible things, right? And that allowed me to grow into different positions, leadership, and everything like that. Which I'm curious. So, as a professional, in a high level corporate position, what is your experience navigating? You're vice president of a very large mining company, one of the largest. And so what has that experience been like navigating that space?
It's tough because what you said really struck with me, which is, and I've heard it repeatedly, the so-called people want to be colorblind, right? You're a great engineer who happens to be Indigenous. And I think that often overlooks people want to be their whole self at work. Right? They don't just put on a hat of being an engineer and a hat of being Indigenous and then wear one or the other as the circumstances allow. That their whole self is all of that, right? And I think for any leader, particularly as you navigate to a higher level of an organization, actually it is harder to bring your whole self and to bring the things that you champion, different experiences, right? And different understandings. And I think it's been hard sometimes when I've heard in organizations, well, we've done this Indigenous reconciliation thing for 3 years. When is this going to blow over? Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not our case here. But I've seen that in other organizations, and you kind of scratch your head and kind of go, well, then I guess you never really were committed. And what are you saying to people within your organization that you want to recognize? What are you saying to communities with whom you want to do business? What are you saying to people with whom you want to be the workforce of the future? And so I have found it at the higher echelons, it's harder to maintain an identity and that sense of self and who you bring that whole self to your work and not subsume it or put it aside for the experience of the role or your personal certifications. And I think that's a shame, right? And I think it comes back to what we talked about is, seeing vocal champions and actual role models, Indigenous people at the executive level and in the boardroom, importantly, in the bank, when you need that line of credit to build a project, because it normalizes without losing anything. You would never see, I would think, a female executive or a CEO or a COO who isn't her whole self by saying, I am a woman and I'm a senior executive. And I think it should be proudly the same for Indigenous people, regardless.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we're seeing examples. It always reminds me, I think, there's kind of it's almost uncomfortable. I find, if I present myself as Indigenous, right? And so, and I speak in things in terms of those experiences, and it's really a mixed bag, and it's changing. Canada and people and all of our people within this country are getting much more open to kind of understanding, learning the truth part behind truth and reconciliation, really. And to achieve reconciliation, you got to create spaces to talk about these types of things, right? And but yeah, it's interesting. Some people just don't want to hear it. They just, they have no time for it, right? And but I am glad to say that is less and less common, not just for me, but for people in the circle and people we talk about. It's Indigenous people feel more comfortable bringing their whole self at the door. I stole this phrase from a good friend of mine. He said, "Yeah, I just got tired of leaving my Indian at the door." I was like, "No, we go through that door together. We're one and the same. Not There's no filter anymore. I'm one and the same everywhere I go, and that's who I am. And I just do not feel comfortable. There's things that make me uniquely me, but I don't think they take away from the things that I'm doing, which was profound."
And I think with that, it would be interesting as leaders, as Indigenous leaders, how to help carry people through that because people don't know. It would be totally awesome, I think, in your case, if somebody said, Yeah, you're an Indigenous engineer. So tell me about that. Like, tell me, so what's special? Tell me about the combination of that and what that brings and the value. Because I do think sometimes they hear just engineer and that they can compartmentalize what that means or what that brings, or they hear Indigenous and they see that in one, I think, small, I don't want to mean diminished, but a constrained part of what value that brings to an organization. And so, as opposed to what's the multiplying force of that, right? What kind of different perspectives can you bring? How can we learn from that? What new value can you create for the organization, for yourself, and for your community?
Mhm.
That I think is the exciting opportunity. But it's going to be rare to have a senior leader and a CEO kind of stop you in your tracks and ask you that. So I do think it's not just getting through the door, but then it's bringing that and then
Mhm.
importantly, bringing others along with that to help them understand that.
Yeah, it's something that I've been incredibly passionate about in terms of understanding. I even wrote something on it and was published from an academic space. But I draw on my experience that I'm always so interested in other people's experience, not like me, and how would that help make things better, right? And so I think there's a sense of humility that comes through that is that, okay, women in this space, what is their perspective? What are my biases, my challenging my privilege and everything like that? And how can we make things better, not just inclusive, not just more, welcoming, but like, okay, can I think about things differently, right? Can we think about this process differently? Can we think about management differently? And can we think about managing people? And yeah, like I think we're losing a huge opportunity if we don't, again, embrace the different perspective and opinion because it's overwhelming. The diversity of thought adds so much to the bottom line, adds so much to organizational health, its ability to respond in a dynamic and a quick way. It's actually good business. And it's funny we talk about it and it's a cultural issue, but then everything says that it's good for business, right? But it's again, I think people need to just be okay with being a little bit uncomfortable. Be okay that things are different. Other people are different. Other people have different perspectives, right? And that's a good thing, not a bad thing, right?
Well, we don't live in a static world where tomorrow will look like yesterday. And so I think the opportunity to tap in to a broad breadth of experience, of different mindsets, just different values, even, can I think unlock or get people unstuck out of the old ways of doing things. And it's not a solution to one problem, it's just an approach to life's journey, I think, that could be done differently within a company. And so I think companies that embrace that diversity, not from the outside, but from what's within and bring that out, we've only just scratched the surface in I think what's possible.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe we already answered this next kind of thought of mine. So do you think it's more important to have, I think, equitable Indigenous representation in upper management and C-suite and boards?
Yeah, I think if you don't see yourself up there, it's hard to imagine. It's not impossible, but
Mhm.
it's harder to imagine. I think that there is a responsibility for resource communities to reflect the communities from which the resources come and for the people who are impacted by that. And quite frankly, there are excellent accountants, HR professionals, engineers, scientists, you name it, out there of an Indigenous background or from an Indigenous community that should be drawn upon. So, yeah, I think that there could be a better job on corporate governance of better reflecting the Indigenous reality in Canada.
I think one of the affirming experiences I had was I've had some people come up to me and said, seeing you in that, I can identify you're relatable. I can identify maybe not so much words, but you're like me, grew up like me, and you're doing these really neat things like, so it's a possibility, right? And so, or it's an opportunity, or I could see myself doing some of those things. And I think it really resonated strongly with me is that there's, there's these ceilings, right? And so I think about my own experience. I grew up in Cumberland. I never knew an engineer. I never knew people doing the things I was doing. And then maybe I would have done them much more quicker, much more efficient, with much less issue, with much less problem, which much more confidence, and I'm probably confident saying I probably would achieve things, if I just knew they were possible and identification relation, it really matters, right? So seeing representation is good. It's good for the health of the corporate Canada. It's good for the health of the industry. It's good for the health of, I think, the public. People should see themselves in any opportunity. Then it motivates, then it pushes productivity, and presence and engagement, everything. If you could see your opportunities everywhere, then you'll push yourself to be able to pursue and to participate, right? And so representation matters. Absolutely love that. So, in terms of pursuing those type of opportunities, what advice would you give young Indigenous people starting out in the industry, like mining or any other industry? Young person,
Yeah.
young Indigenous person.
No, nobody gets ahead alone. You
Love it.
know,
Love it.
nobody gets ahead alone. You will need mentors that are official or unofficial throughout your career. You will rely on networks forever throughout your life. I think there's a quote someone, never talk bad of a stranger because you never know if they're an angel in disguise, right? And so that sense of kind of taking the risk to put yourself out there to connect with people. I mean, I respond to every email, and I often get calls from people who, like have seen me speak
Mhm,
somewhere and said, "Oh, I heard about something in your story or your background that resonated with me, and I'd
mhm,
like to follow up." And, maybe 9 times out of 10, that person never gets a response. It gets lost in the email ether, but you never know when somebody will. Um, and people, particularly in leadership opportunity spaces, take care to develop other people and types of people. And it's not transactional of, well, can I get you a job or an internship or something? It's, can I say something that inspires you to pursue something or think of something in a different way? So, I would always strongly encourage to build, life and the journey of life and careers are nothing but a series of relationships that work out and, invest the time to do that. And particularly if you're young, to learn. Mining in particular is one where, from a workforce perspective, we will run out of miners before we run out of minerals. And so the competition for talent in, you know, every job we have, we'll probably need three of them in the next 10 years. And there'll be jobs that don't even exist today that will be around in 10 years. So, just from a purely selfish sector perspective, I want people to be curious about mining. I want people to challenge. I want people to reach out. Heaven forbid, I do not want the algorithms of LinkedIn to be the only filter that get people into our company, right? I want people to get people into our company. And so, it can be as simple as doing some research or connecting or attending a speech or listening to a podcast and reaching out. People can reach out to me after this one if they would like, and I'd love to respond back because I have been blessed in my own career of taking that blind chance, and everywhere along the way there's been a hand to help them.
Absolutely. Like, yeah, this, all your points, and especially this one. And I remember I was just talking to my mother. We were kind of, talking about some kind of concepts in Korean, whatever, and just talking in general. And I remember saying, I don't think I've ever done anything really by myself. Someone taught me something, like, and there's all these inputs. And then I said, I really struggle when I work with people or when you talk to people and they give up a sense like I accomplished, I did this, and yeah, I'm sure you did, absolutely. But there's all these inputs. This is community, and we've learned so much. Everything I've learned and accomplished is on the shoulders of giants, right? And people who have done so much before me. And I think that's an incredibly important lesson. And to continue to go forward, right? And then the relational aspect, and then, and then where you reach out, you give, you get back in return. And it's not about transaction and dollars and cents and the balance of things, or taking advantage. It's truly, genuinely, you're right. There's leaders everywhere that would genuinely and generously give time and mentorship and leadership and receive that and pay that forward, right? And
Hmm.
that's an incredibly and powerful lesson, and especially powerful for young people. Connect, put yourself out there, meet people. We grow as a community, right? We grow with other people, with the supports of yeah, our immediate, our extended, professional, and everything like that. An incredible, important lesson. I think people should recognize and should internalize. They should do it. So
Yeah,
thank you for that.
you bet.
So, switching gears here a little bit, what are the key benefits? Mining's a little bit different, but I still love talking about it. What are the key benefits to seeing greater Indigenous participation, but even major ownership in energy projects and there's the exploration of indigenous ownership and mining activity right now.
Mhm.
There's interest. There's efforts to secure capital. But how, what are the key benefits to that, and how can communities maximize those opportunities?
Well, what's fascinating is two real big things. And having worked in a number of other resource sectors, particularly oil and gas and electricity, mining I find is on the cusp of a worldwide explosion or expansion. I think the world is waking up to critical minerals go into everything. They go into your cell phone, to an electric car, to artificial intelligence, to satellites and drones. And they're broadly distributed. Not everybody has them. The US hasn't been mining for decades in a significant way. Canada has, and only uses roughly 1 to 2% of the mines they pull out from underground. So there's going to be this huge demand around the world for critical minerals, and I think that's great for Canada because I think Canada has an excellent reputation internationally. So, in a world where the stock market can change on the day because somebody puts out on Twitter his daily thoughts. That's a really volatile world to live in. Canada's steady approach, I think, is actually going to be a haven for investment, and that's great for job creation. That's great for prosperity creation. That's great for responsible development. So to me, the opportunity is kind of threefold. There is definitely the wealth creation opportunity for active participation in projects, whether that's direct capital investment, um, whether it's equity or debt or something else, whatever works for a particular nation or individuals. But there's going to be huge needs for capital, and we're going to have to find new sources of capital. Two, absolutely on the job creation. Like I said, where we've got kind of an aging workforce, we've got a growing demand. We don't replace our workforce as fast as we could. We probably operate with about a chronic 10% vacancy rate. Jobs are there, and they're jobs of the future, right? Some might be hard hats and going under mine or underground. Some might be driving trucks remotely from the surface in Sudbury down in an underground mine in Brazil. And we have those types of operations that just continually blow my mind. And then there's the opportunity at the community level to be active participants in terms of how some development is done. There will be, I think, tremendous pressure. And this is one of the things that I think it will be very interesting to see after the federal election. There'll be tremendous pressure to look at regulatory reform and how projects can be moved faster, right? In some years, 15, 20 years to get mine permits. And we have governments and politicians talking about getting that down to under 5 years. That has to be done, but cannot be done by stepping over duty to consult or responsible community engagement. And so, how to find that balance? That needs community leadership and participation and involvement to shape that and not be shaped by it. So for me, as I see it, there's just enormous individual opportunity from jobs for families to investment for communities to a voice for communities to shape how is the land around us going to be managed for generations. But I would say that there's going to be an aggressive push in the next 10 years around the world, and Canada can stand to benefit and be a leader in that space, or we might see that opportunity pass us by. But on the mining side, critical minerals are here to stay, and there's an urgent need to get more of them out of the ground.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that really leads into my next thought. It's really fascinating having been kind of a mining and energy professional for, the last 25 years myself. It's fascinating and being a student of, I think, the agreements and the mechanisms that facilitate Indigenous relationship development and everything. Participant, practitioner, benefactor, all those kind of things, and it's fascinating, discouraging. It's such a roller coaster of emotions being an Indigenous person, watching, that progress, right? And so Indigenous communities, I get there's a lot of distrust. There's a lack of, capacity financial. And then of course, the technical capacity to navigate, consultation and, regulation and permits and all that type of stuff. But there's also a distrust, that I see changing because there's more capacity being built. There's more facilitation. There's more inclusion. A lot of that's changing. But, regulatory reform, right? And I see a regulatory environment that reflects a lot of our challenges in the past. Now there's a risk aversion, right? And so, case law, case study, everything that says you can't challenge Indigenous rights and title and Section 35 and traditional territory. I think a lot of that was, of course, railroaded at first through development, and then you've seen a lot of challenging case law and evolution, and then of course Indigenous communities standing up. But now it's interesting. We have that environment again, risk aversion. It's highly bureaucratic. It's it reflects that time. But I've seen industry move past and forward, and it's fascinating. Where no, we want to develop these relationships. We do want to seek partnerships. It's not just about stakeholder management. It's about partnerships. It's about meaningful engagement. It's about all those things. And one of the things we say a lot of times is there's nothing but opportunity for community that step up and say, okay, we want to do this and we want to do it right. And we do want to see, we don't want to compromise, like you said, regulatory efficiency, effectiveness, not compromise. You still satisfy the duties, still satisfy, our environmental impact assessment, but at the same time, build more confidence in the process, shorten that process, right? And so that we're all public's confident, government's confident, industry's confident, and communities confident and engaged. But yeah, there's nothing but opportunity for a community that get up, that understand, what are my rights? What are the impacts to my rights? How do we manage those? What does our community look like in terms of needs, our gaps, opportunities, and then just get really ready. If they're not already in that space already, get really ready for, yes, we want to jump into a partnership. And, this is kind of everything looks like. This is what consent looks like. This is our governance, and this is how we make decisions, and nothing but opportunity in that space, right? So, and you
I
spoke.
love what Sorry, I was going to say, I love what you said about confidence because I think that's the one thing that everybody wants on all sides
Mhm.
around that, whether it's from industry, from government, from indigenous, from communities, because, businesses abhor ambiguity and risk. And if you don't have the confidence that, conversations can occur that can lead to agreements that can lead to development. And it's on the flip side as well, right? If indigenous communities can't trust governments to stick by the rules that they've set out for people to develop and say, well, something's changed, we need to change the rules now, and sorry, consultation's not as important as we thought it was, or participation and partnership is not as important. That's not fair, and that's going to set back the confidence that your word matters. I mean, what matters more than anything? Your word is your integrity, whatever the legislation might be. And so I think that's the one thing that I would advise governments in this period of sort of intense pressure to see how to become more efficient is move only as fast as the confidence will grow.
No, that's a great statement. And so, yeah, it's all about confidence and trust, right? And so, and move only as fast as you build those and sustain those, right? So, I think there's a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities. What do you think are some of the biggest opportunities for Indigenous people, for Indigenous communities in Canada's evolving resource development landscape? What's Canada's biggest opportunity?
Well, I'd say the two big ones are probably LNG development
Hmm.
over the next 10 to 20 years and mining. Mining is, whether it's potash or copper or nickel or lithium, it's broadly distributed across Canada. Every province will have its unique circumstances for development. But I think I've noticed conversations changing, and maybe the threat of sovereignty from the outside, from our neighbors to the south, has maybe galvanized everybody to look at these issues a little bit differently. But it's, every type of participation or opportunity is different to every Indigenous community and their circumstances, their risk tolerance. There's going to be infrastructure projects needed, right? Maybe it's on power production. Maybe it's on electricity transmission. Maybe it's on ports development. I know Premier Canoe in Manitoba is very keen to develop the Churchill port and give us some northern access as well for resources. Often people ask me, is ownership, the best? Well, it is if you can take the risk of putting money in and seeing it go down and up. Maybe providing loans and that sort of thing to projects are better because you know what, you're going to get your money back and you get paid a little bit of a dividend along the way, but you're not taking as big a risk as the ownership model. So, I think that all of that has got to fit with what does a community want for itself and to know itself of, what is it comfortable with, right? And so I think not only direct investment or direct financial participation in some mining or energy projects, But like I said, the ancillary infrastructure around that is going to be essential. Services around that. There's just such a big ecosystem
Hmm.
around that. So I think, communities and Indigenous investment needs to align with it's not only its values, but its risk tolerance as
Hmm.
well, and how much it wants to be participative in. But anything that it invests in should be of a long-term benefit to jobs, to knowledge, to community building, to security. It's not just about a rate of return.
Yeah, absolutely. There's much more, I think, benefit to, yeah, just the rate of return and source revenues. There's, yeah, building human resource capacity, the expertise, the acumen, the procurement, the supply chain. And then, yeah, you're right. Ownership is certainly, it is out there as one of the one of the better ways to ensure consent and to ensure involvement and to ensure benefit and to ensure co-governance. But there's so much other ways that communities can meaningfully involved in the resource development, right?
Totally. And we look at that as, elements of projects, full-on projects, whether it's our Thompson mine or looking at some new clean energy in Labrador and the way in which Indigenous partners can participate and be partners. There's any number of ways to structure something. So I
Mm.
don't think there's a silver bullet of this is the best way. I think ownership is great, but you've got to accept all that comes with that, right? So
Yes.
I think it's almost a case by case or community by community basis.
No, it absolutely is, and you're absolutely right. It's all dependent on the risk tolerance and where people want to put their energy and effort, and and that's I think that's a major component to what we talk about in terms of we stand behind self-determination wholeheartedly, right? And so communities and Indigenous people absolutely need the ability to self-determine, right? It's the kind of the basis for reconciliation is to figure out what we want to do, who we want to be, in regard to kind of the historical and current relationship, to be able to do that, to be able to determine what does the future of our communities, ourselves and our communities look like, and it's incredibly important. That's awesome. So yeah, we're coming kind of the top of the top of our hour our Tim Wynn, our little chit chat, and so kind of back to you. What's next for you? What kind of exciting things or projects or initiatives or, self-development, or are you going to chase killer whales and, or run away from them or head out to the Arctic again, or, what's going on? So,
Yeah, I'm a big outdoors adventurer. I love to travel every part of this country. I want to kayak the Nahanni this summer if I can. I'd love to get to hike in the Torngat Mountains in Labrador. I love the outdoors of this country, coast to coast. Yeah, I'd like to take a break. It's been a busy start to
mhm,
the year, but for me, I think just continuing to serve, continuing to create opportunity for people. Pulled a good joke on my friends on Facebook on April Fool's saying I was going to run for politics, but I actually want to do good for society, so I think I can find some other way to do that. No, I feel very privileged, and I'm grateful
mhm.
every day, and I mark that by starting every team meeting I have by starting with a moment of gratitude. It brings us into the present. It gets people to recognize the contribution coming to that point of nobody does it alone. Whatever success you had, somebody else helped you along the way. And I think it creates a spirit and a culture to recognize and see people. I see you, I see what you've done, something big or something small. And if I can affect positive change in people's lives along the way and make this a better industry for Indigenous people to work in, I will have been very privileged at the end of my career.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. And you heard it, everyone. There's certainly a call to action in there. Have confidence, reach out, build relationships. Don't be afraid to put yourself out there and serve people, serve your community, serve your interests, and serve yourself. And don't forget all those things and maintain that relationship and balance. So I hope you've all enjoyed today's episode of Indigenous Voices in Resource Development. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Thank you.
Thank you, John.